Hello, good morning, everybody. Are we ready? Alden, are we ready? Yes, we're ready. A warm jobs and welcome to everybody that has joined us here this morning. This briefing session, we are going to talk about the Jobs Fund's 12th funding round. We're going to share with you why we are focusing on the informal economy and the green economy. We are going to share with you how to complete your application, our eligibility criteria, our impact criteria, and importantly, how we in the Jobs Fund measure success. So thank you very much to all of you for joining. I think it's not necessary for me to talk about the state of unemployment in our country. Suffice to say that only 10% of those who would like to work are absorbed in the labor market. Now, I'm going to repeat that. Only 10% of those who would like to work, i.e., those who are actively seeking employment, are able to be absorbed into the labor market. That is a horrific statistic. And government has many interventions designed to address this particular challenge. And the Jobs Fund is one of those and complements some of the other programs that the government of South Africa has implemented. My team here this morning are going to be doing the presentations, but also there's a backup team who will be listening closely to the questions that you have, and we are going to encourage you to please submit those questions in the chat. Everybody has been placed on mute. There's about 545 people on the call at the moment, right? And I think it's important that sometimes we don't always understand each other when we pose a question. So please, Maya, encourage you to post the question in the chat. The team will then respond to those questions in the chat. I have found, though, sometimes those questions comes through fast and furious. And so we give you an undertaking that if we didn't answer your question during the session, we most certainly will update our frequently asked questions and post that onto our website. Let me also say at the beginning, the presentation will be posted on the Jobs Fund website at the end of this session. The answers to the frequently asked questions will be posted in this chat. And so you can go and reference there if perhaps, there's a question that we didn't receive sufficient clarity on. It might be that we've already answered that in our frequently asked questions section. Also, we've put you all on mute for now. It really is impossible to manage all the content and also then not let other viewers, participants be disturbed. Sometimes we enter a meeting space and forget to mute our microphone. So to keep things smooth, we've muted you for now, but you have the opportunity to post your questions and we will then try and respond to the best of our ability. With that, I'm going to hand you over to my team. I think, Xavier, are you next up?
Yes.
There we go. Thank you very much, everybody, and good luck. And thank you for participating.
Okay. A very good morning to all, and thank you, DDG, for the welcome. I'll just quickly go through what we are going to cover today. Let me just check. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, so today as the DDG has indicated, the purpose of today's session is to take you through our 12th call for proposal, specifically focusing on what is contained in the term sheet and responding to any guidance, any issues that you might have as we go on. So we are going to cover issues of the term sheet. We're going to talk about the green economy and fauna economy. Then we talk about the funding windows that are available, our eligibility, and how we measure the impact, and also the issue of the measurement of our indicators, and then also talk about contracting, and also what is the way forward, how do the application. So those are the sections that we are going to cover in this session. Thanks. Next slide, Slani. Again, move to the next one. Thank you very much. So you see that our slides are populated a lot. We will not cover word for word. The purpose of this is, since this is going to be shared, if you want to make a reference to that to it, you will have more details. So the key thing that I want to point out in this particular slide is to emphasize that the Jobs Fund was established in 2011, and it is a program of National Treasury. What is very important to note is that we do operate on a challenge fund principles. So we are using the challenge fund in this case to see how best we can leverage other funds from other private sector, NGO, and so forth, to co-fund and test. So the most important is we want to test those innovative ideas, innovative initiatives that can enhance job creation in the country. We have given you the statistics of what we have done here, but the most important point that I need to pick here is that through working with our partners, we've managed to identify and to develop new approaches in terms of how to address unemployment challenges in the country. For example, at the beginning of the when Jobs Fund started, there wasn't much talk about demand-led training. There was always sometimes training for the sake of training. But now, mostly wherever you go, there is now a demand-led training. So the Jobs Fund has demonstrated, working with partners, that there is value in doing such interventions in the country, instead of just doing training for the sake of training. I would also want to just pick out one more statistic on this slide in terms of the leverage. So the Jobs Fund is managed to bring in match funding or to leverage about 15 billion. And this is more than tripling the investment that has been put by the Jobs Fund through the grant disbursements. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Now, how does the Jobs Fund work? I'll focus on the first four box, but this takes us to where we are. We are aware now that the call for proposal is open. So we are at a stage now, yourselves, and that's why you're here. You're interested in applying. You want to hear more about the fund. So you are going to, first of all, do completion of the eligibility. Once you've done it, again, my colleague Eldon will go into detail later on. You do the eligibility. If you pass the auto eligibility, you complete the application, then there'll be documentation that you are supposed to upload. And this just emphasize, again, my colleague will talk about it later, Helena. The documentation is very, very important that you go through, you see what documents are required, because these are the documents which we'll use for the due diligence, and we'll do verification on these documents to ensure that we have credible applications. So once the call closes on the 5th of June at 3 p.m. exactly, not 3:01, okay, we will commence internal processes. We'll do eligibility. And I need to emphasize here that eligibility runs throughout until the final approval. We will be checking at each stage, is there anything that makes this thing ineligible, because things change as we go on. We'll then do the appraisals. We'll undertake due diligence for those projects that would have been selected to proceed to the next stage. And our due diligence encompasses physical site visits and virtual where possible, but definitely physical site visits will happen. And this will also encompass verification of the documents that would have been submitted. So it is very important that you ensure that you submit to us all your critical documents, credible documents, and you have them be able to guide our team as they engage you. Thereafter, the application will be considered by the committee for approval or for decline. I will stop at that because that is, I think, what is important for today. The next phase will be once we are approved. Next slide, please. Okay. Our DDG did mention already at the beginning in terms of the unemployment figures, so we'll not go into that. But it is always just to note what is the context in which the 12th call for proposal is coming. The context is on the backdrop of the high unemployment, as the DDG has indicated. And then when you look at the informal sector, in which you compare South Africa with other emerging economies, the country is not faring well. If you look at the statistics from Q4 2014, only about 20% of those 17 million employed were in the informal economy. But when you look forward, the NDP is looking at creating 2.1 million jobs in 2030. But again, there are some issues that need to be addressed. There are a lot of barriers that must be addressed for this to happen. And this is what we are here at the Jobs Fund to say to you as partners, how can we work with you? What ideas do we have there that can do the unlocking? So from our research, we have identified that the informal and the green economies could be the sectors that, or are the sectors that will contribute significantly to job creation. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I've already covered this. Can move on to the next slide. So if you look at the jobs again under the Jobs Fund 12th call for proposal, I've mentioned we are working on the Challenge Fund principles. So what does it mean when you say Challenge Fund principles? What it means that all applications, when you apply, they are all assessed at once, and applications are going to compete amongst each other. So only the best will then be approved. We always get issues when an application is declined to say, but my application is the best. It does this for this province or for this municipality. Yes, by it being declined by the Jobs Fund, it is not to say your application is a bad application. It simply means it was not competitive enough among those that were submitted. So we are looking or calling upon potential applicants to come up with innovative solutions in job creation. And this falls in various windows: enterprise development, support for work seekers, and institutional capacity building, which my colleague Nazim will cover on later in detail. But what we are looking for are what are those innovative solutions in those sectors. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at the informal economy. Okay. I want to take an opportunity to read word for word the definition so that it is very, very clear, because we've been asked so many questions about what is the informal economy, and I don't want to lose anyone. So this one, I'll read word for word. So we're saying the informal economy encompasses economic activities, enterprises, jobs, and the workers that are not covered by formal arrangements. That's very, very important. Now, what are those employment barriers? So having done the research, we have identified some key employment barriers, and we've outlined these unemployment barriers here. I will pick a few. One of them is access to market. Again, we know the struggle that especially the informal businessmen face. Once they have their produce, once they have their product, how do I access the market? So we are therefore looking at those interventions that are holistic, that will also cover things like market access. Finance constraints is very, finance, access to finance or affordable finance is very important again, and it is hampering job creation in the informal sector. And that is also something that we are looking to address. Capacity building. We have so many institutions that have capacity to assist in unlocking employment in the informal sector, but they have challenges. So there is need for capacity buildings. We know some of the most businesses, they have the challenges, the informal sector businesses have challenges when it comes to financial literacy, when they just come to business skills. So we are looking at those models that can innovatively unlock such. We don't know those models. So that's why we are coming to you. And that is why it is a challenge fund to say, what is it that you have experienced from there? What is it that you can put on the table so that we can come up with those replicable, innovative job creation models? Next slide, please. Okay. Now, in the informal sector, we have identified priority sectors, but this is not exclusive. So we're not saying what is not listed here is excluded. This is just an example. So if you look at some of the examples, look, for example, at the construction and informal building traders. You look at what is the activities, mainly in the low income and rural areas. There's so much happening there. And we need to be able to, how do we harness and capture that into the labor market? You look at the informal agriculture. How are we using new technology? How can we bring the informal farmers? Now it's mainly emerging farmers. How can we bring them so that their goods are also accepted in terms of the market? Then also the accessing of the financing for such. We also have issues of repairs and repair services. So many repairs happens in the informal sector, mechanics and so forth and so forth. How do we bring them that into the so that we can account for their jobs, so that they can join that pool of the employed workforce? So these are some of the examples that we are looking for, and our term sheet detail each of these and also clearly specifies where do we see the labor absorption aspects. So it is very, very important to talk about labor absorption sectors and subsectors. It is those sectors that can make a meaningful impact when you talk of job creation in the country. Next slide, please. Now, let me go to green economy. Again, only for once on this slide, I'll read word for word only for the definition so that there's no doubt of what we are talking about. So the green economy refers to economic activities that aim to reduce environmental risks and ecological scarcities, and that aim for sustainable development without degrading the environment. Having done our research also, we have identified key barriers in this sector. And these barriers are driven mainly because this is almost like a fairly new sector. You're talking about skills gap. Being a fairly new sector, skills are always a challenge. So we need to find ways of how do we train? How do we ensure that there's access to funding? The challenge given that arises to the risks when you come to investment in the green economy. There is also an issue of uncertainty of policies. All those issues needs to be addressed if we are going to have an impactful intervention within the green economy. Okay. Again, these are examples of the barriers which we have detailed in our term sheet. Next slide, please. Okay. Now let's look at some sectors, which is again an example. I want just, however, to emphasize one point, that when we talk of green economy, you see an example there with renewable energy. People might always think about, oh, okay, I'm going to ask to build a massive infrastructure. We need to point out from that applications that are going to be seeking funding for huge funding for establishment of huge infrastructure are not acceptable. We also clearly made that in our term sheet. So here what we're looking for example, under the renewable energy, we're looking at those in the value chain. What are those activities, opportunities that are rising in the manufacturing, in the installation and the maintenance? So we're not looking at coming to build a geothermal, coming to build a massive windmill. No. Okay. Another example that I can also pick that is important here, and so all examples are important. I'm just picking some few examples as an illustration. The issue of waste management and recycling. Again, it is very, very important in terms of when you look at the greening of the economy, the impact that we need to face when it comes to how in various municipalities, how are we dealing with waste and so forth. That needs to be addressed. Again, we're looking at those ideas. Water waste management, we have so many challenges, especially when you look at some various parks and so forth, who are struggling when it comes to things like the invasive alien plants. All those falls under the, when you look at the water management, waste management, but more of water management, how do you address all those issues? So that's what we are looking for as examples of the green economy, and also covers agriculture. What are the new technologies that we are utilizing? What are those organic farming methods that we're utilizing to achieve this? Next slide, please. Okay, so what does a competitive application look like from the Jobs Fund point of view? We do list all the aspects there, but the fundamental aspect is you must be addressing, the application must be addressing the relevant barriers. When we're doing on our origination, we've always mentioned to people, please read the term sheet. Maybe 4 or 5 times. It is very important, because sometimes you get an application that is actually not addressing what we are identifying here. We need proven success. We need to show that there's innovation. We need to ensure that you are demonstrating impact. All those must come out clearly. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, this will be my last slide before I hand you to Nazim. Again, it's emphasizing the key issues that we've spoken about. The issue of the market access, issue of match funding that will require, and the issue of how are you monitoring and tracking your impact. On that note, I'll hand you over to Nazim on the next set of the presentation. Nazim, over to you.
Thank you, Xavier. Good morning to everybody. So I'm going to be covering funding windows and various criteria that is currently in the term sheet, eligibility as well as impact. So to enterprise development, and just following on what Xavier says, the Jobs Fund has 4 funding windows, right, that we have traditionally funded through. However, in this particular call for proposals, we only have 3 of those 4. The one excluded was the infrastructure window. As Xavier said, we're not looking, our intention is not to fund large infrastructure project. What we will consider via the other 3 windows is funding enabling infrastructure, and a little bit more about that in a later slide. So to the enterprise development windows, this is really the demand side interventions that we're looking to fund. Those that develops small businesses, for example, whether it's informal or green, and then creates demand for labor in the economy or in the project itself. So it's about supporting SMEs or micro enterprises, but the Jobs Fund looks to fund projects that provides a holistic package of support to those businesses. Yes, of course, access to finance is a critical issue, but we have found over the years of implementing a number of these projects that there are core components that has to be present over and above finance, like business development services, like mentorship, access to market over and above what we look for finance. So when we consider an initiative under this window, that is what we look for. From a finance perspective, very often we get initiatives where funding is too expensive. We've got to be very clear as to what the Jobs Fund grant does to enable that funding then to be provided to the SMMEs or micro enterprises that makes it affordable and suitable. And when we say suitable, we're talking about suitable financial products that suits the type of industry that you're dealing with and the type of requirements for the various SMMEs. It's not just a one-size-fits-all. We spoke earlier about enabling infrastructure. There's a number of examples listed there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's important that in submitting an application form for enabling infrastructure, that in the application it is very clear how that then translates to growth of the targeted beneficiaries and ultimately how the jobs gets created from there. Next slide, please. Okay, funding window. So the first one, the enterprise development, was really the demand side intervention where we create or we facilitate the creation of jobs. The support for work seekers is really about linking active work seekers, right? Supporting those active work seekers, transitioning them from unskilled to skilled so that they can take advantage of opportunities that exist in the market. So it's really a matching thing. One thing from here, I'm not going to say too much about this, but the one thing I will say, any application under the support seeker windows has to be a demand-led intervention, right? It cannot simply be a training intervention because, as Xavier would have said earlier, we are not here to compete with other government entities. The SETAs fund training, right? We are not we do not fund training for the sake of it. We fund training where it is part of the journey of that young person to become employed. Thank you. Next slide, please. Institutional capacity building, quite frankly, in my opinion, probably the most difficult one of the windows, both to apply for as well as to assess. And it is probably one of the most important. We at the Jobs Fund have recognized that unless you build capacity on the ground at local level through building institutions, you're not really going to have the desired impact at those local levels, at community level. And we, this particular window, this particular funding window enables the Jobs Fund to support the growth of those institutions so that they can do more within the targeted areas that they do, and then ultimately facilitate through that further job creation within those economic sectors or geographic sectors, right? The issue very critical here is that in applying through this, one has got to be clear about what the funding gap, what are you asking the Jobs Fund to fund, right? Private sector, and particularly from a private sector, a for-profit entity, we have to have the funding gap. The grant can never be used simply to sweeten the returns on a particular investment or infrastructure project, for argument's sake. So again, there are various ideal applications. I'm not going to go through all of those, but again, critical, the funding gap in this and how that capacity translates into the creation or the support of beneficiaries and creation of jobs ultimately is critical in supplying when applying under this window. Thank you. Move on to the next part of it, and here we look at the eligibility criteria. Now, all of these are, of course, listed in the term sheet. There are various exploratory or explanatory notes within the frequently asked questions, which is also on our website. So I'm not going to deal with all of them. I'm going to focus on a few critical ones. Of course, the minimum grant size is 5 million. I saw that question come through in the chat. Match funding is the critical example. This is a key differentiator between the Jobs Fund and other government-funded initiatives. Efficiency in spend from government, we say, if we can leverage funding from the market, whether it's the private sector, the rest of the public sector, social sector, we drive the efficiency through which the grant is spent or allocated, and therefore drives impact. In how much impact can we achieve, because we have now increased the size of various interventions through this. That's the importance of the match funding. And the second part is it is about skin in the game as well, right? It is about commitment. What we are doing here is we're creating a partnership between two parties, and bringing on match funding strengthens that commitment to that particular partnership and the project itself. So there are various types of match funding. Let me just take a step back. We differentiate between for-profit entities and not-for-profit entities. Very important. It's not about private sector or public sector, right? Because an NPC is classified as a private sector entity. So it is about for-profit entities and for non-profit entities. For-profit entities and private and public sector institutions, the minimum ratio is 1:1. For not-for-profit entities, that be your NPCs, NGOs, that would be 1:0.5. So somebody correctly explained that. For every rand that an NGO requests from the Jobs Fund, they have to commit 50 cents to that project as well. So 50% of what you're asking for. Obviously, it's 1:1. It's a rand versus rand for a private sector entity. So another comment on that, Xavier was talking about the competitive framework in which we operate. 1:0.5 for an NGO, for 1:1 for a private, basically effectively buys you a ticket to the game, right? From a competitive perspective, all else being equal in two projects, if one is at 1:2, i.e. they're bringing 2 rand versus Jobs Fund's rand, and the other one is at the minimum level, right? Obviously, the one that brings the higher level of match funding is seen as more competitive. I have to say that is all else being equal, right? So let's just look at the types of match funding we have. We've got self-funded match funding, which basically comes from your balance sheet. And here we would look at the applicant's balance sheet to understand whether they are able to actually contribute that match funding, right? Match funding from third parties or loan funding that you unlock from a financial institution, for argument's sake. That is also part of match funding. So this type of match funding. So here we will look at formula written undertakings. So in an agriculture project, for argument's sake, you're partnering with the land bank. The land bank is providing you with a match funding. We would either look for a formal written undertaking, proof that you have applied to those institutions, and then undertaking of support from that institutions or match funders, right? And we will then track progress. Now, one thing you must remember that when you apply, that is required. When we then go to the investment committee for final approval, we would need a commitment from the various funders to then explain, give that to the investment committee to give them comfort that the match funding requirements have been met. And of course, when we contract, we would need the final contracts in place so that we contract on a specific number that has been approved. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, consortiums, right? I'm talking about number 4 here. Very often we get requests around, we are 3 partners, we're not sure who should apply, right? Well, the answer is the decision as to who to apply is up to you, but you can't all 3 apply, right? We have to have a lead applicant, and then you can bring the other 2 on as partners, okay? Now, in doing that, we are very clear as to what we expect to see from a partnership, right? We expect to see the benefits, the contributions, whether it's financial, non-financial, of those partners to them. And we then look at whether that is equitable. whether the benefit, there's a cost-benefit analysis done, and we see if that is equitable for the various partners. Also, we look at, of course, an applicant has to be solvent, right? We are not allowed to fund companies in distress. You must have been operating for 2 years and have audited and independently reviewed financial statements for those 2 years. Those are requirements for all applicants. There's no distinction. All applicants have to comply with that. And yeah, then from a addition to the financial statements. So for example, if your year end is, let's say 30 June last year, all right, you haven't got your 30 June 25 financials yet. 30 June, you're applying by 31 March, for argument's sake, or let's say 30 April. Oh, sorry, no, I'm talking 15 May, right? So there is a period where we don't have financial records. 30 June last year to 15 May this year, right? We would need management accounts, signed management accounts provided by. So we close that gap between when we have information from the last financial year. Next slide, please. The intellectual property is often one that we get asked about, right? When you submit an application, there's obviously, in many cases, there's intellectual property that belongs to you. That intellectual property will always reside with you. The Jobs Fund will not take it. What we do ask for is for the Jobs Fund to use the concept and the results from there to be able to disseminate learnings to the rest of the market, so we can perpetuate the impact of your project in a wider sense, the systemic change, if you wish. So it is critical that we are able to do that. It is one of the fundamental pillars of the Jobs Fund to be able to do that. But like I said, the intellectual property will continue and will always reside with the applicant. I'm not going to do number 8. Number 8 refers to existing or past Jobs Fund partners. You know who you are. Please look at the requirements for eligibility for you with regard to eligibility. Okay, next slide, please. So that is eligibility, and that is the first part of what we do when we receive the applications. Now, what won't we consider, right? And it's very clear. Ineligible, distressed applicants, and I spoke about that earlier. I spoke about the training activities without a resultant job placement. We are not a training funder. Large capital investments, Xavier spoke about that. Although what I would say around large capital investment, we're quite happy to participate within that ecosystem and do certain projects around and in support of those infrastructure projects. We won't necessarily fund the infrastructure itself. On lending projects, a problem we often have is we approve, and then we do not have the pipeline. So there is a lag between signing the contract and then 6 months later we do our first deal. That creates a problem for us and creates a problem for the fiscus in the sense that we are spending money but not necessarily getting the results therefore. So what we do require from an on-lending project is to submit a pipeline of projects, and also very important, a statement of how they go about doing or generating such pipeline. So this is one. I'm going to leave number 6. I'll come back to this because it is really around additionality and double dipping. So what suffice to say, we will not fund a project already funded by another entity. That doesn't mean we don't co-fund with other public entities, but the funding has to be complementary. It cannot be for the same activities. And then applications from private sector or for-profit entities that are looking to do commercial development and so forth. The funding gap, as I said, is very important. We need to look at whether that can actually be funded by commercial means from the market. And so the funding gap in terms of that is critical that you state those. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we've done the eligibility criteria. Now we're looking at the impact criteria. Now this is basically what your project will be appraised and assessed and ultimately approved based on the assessment of these 8 criteria. There are their social impact, additionality, and so on, right? And this is consistently applied across all applications, and ultimately we provide the investment committee with an assessment on this basis. Next slide, please. So we will deal with them individually. I'm not going to say a lot in the interest of time. Social is really about the wider impact. Obviously, the main indicator or the main outcome that you would be looking at is jobs. But here we look at the wider social impact on the community, because we do recognize a project does not occur in isolation. It occurs within a particular context. So the social impact might be jobs. It might be supporting business within that community, self-employment interventions, particularly within the formal sector. What is important here is that the application clearly demonstrates how the implementation of the project, of the intervention, right, leads to that social impact. So there must be a link between the project and the social impact we're talking about. Next slide, please. So here, this is an impact criteria. I have to say that it is also a fundamental pillar or founding pillar of the Jobs Fund, in that we do not compete with any other government department. We are not meant to displace other entities, whether it's public or private, and so forth. So additionality is critical for any application. The absence of additionality is likely to mean that an application cannot be approved. Now, what is this additionality? We've often asked that question. And I want to answer you with a number of questions for you to consider, all right? The funding gap again. How is an allocation of public funds from where the Jobs Fund gets its funding justified for the particular intervention? And what is the public good in providing such, right? What happens if the grant from the Jobs Fund is not approved? Right? If the answer to that question is no, we cannot implement this project without the Jobs Fund, then there is additionality. If the answer is we can do this project, but at a lower scale, we require the Jobs Fund grant to scale this project to a particular level that makes sense, that is additionality. Not necessarily as strong as the first case, but that is additionality. If the answer is that no, we will continue to do this, that means there's a lack of a funding gap in that initiative, and therefore there's an absence of additionality. Right. So, and then the third issue I want to talk about is how does a Jobs Fund grant lead to the outcome being achieved, i.e. the Jobs Fund grant is provided to recruit and train young people. How does that then lead to the training and the placement, ultimate placement of those young people? And hence, again, the focus on demand-led interventions. Commercially funded projects, we look at that very carefully. Commercial projects, for example, we would look at your cash flows, your projections. We would look at your profitability going forward, the return on investment you're likely to make, and it's really the funding gap. What is required to be funded from public funds to make this a viable entity? If it's proven to be viable without the Jobs Fund grant, obviously that means there's an absence of additionality. Okay. Next slide, please. Sustainability, another critical component of what we do and how we differentiate ourselves. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about the initiative. We're talking about the beneficiaries that we supported, i.e. the SME, for example, or the emerging farmer, how that supports their sustainability, and of course the jobs that's been created. Right, we carefully look at the term of those jobs, how sustainable they are, because obviously that then also speaks to the quality of what is being done. Now, when we say sustainability, and obviously sometimes it's very difficult to attain sustainability within a 3-year period, right? We then talk about, you'll often hear the language of the Jobs Fund is about a path to sustainability. What we require of an application is to show us how this intervention lead somebody to sustainability, even if it happens after the Jobs Fund project has been completed. Next slide, please. match funding and value for money. Of course, we spend public funds, right? So we actually demand value for money from wherever our best bang for the buck that we're spending. I'm sure all of you would understand that. But you know what? Value for money is not necessarily only a monetary issue. There are various things that we consider at looking at things. Of course, we look at the cost per job creation, but it's wider. It's not that simple, right? We look at the merits of this, what type of support is being provided to the particular beneficiary, and what the outcome is to that over and above jobs. So it's a lot wider than simply a monetary consideration. We spoke about match funding. I'm not going to repeat that. And then risk apportionment. Now, again, this is not necessarily always clear when we see the application, and requires us to dig deeper within the application and discussions with the applicant during the appraisal process. Now, very often we get asked to fund, to de-risk somebody, some financial institution, for argument's sake, right? And we have in the past, and continue probably to continue to do that, because if there's a clear funding gap there and a clear barrier there, for example, access to finance in that case, then there is a case for the Jobs Fund grant to be done. What we though require is that there be, for the Jobs Fund to de-risk a private sector entity, there's got to be significant leverage from that private sector entity. It cannot be a 1:1 match funding ratio, because then we're basically guaranteeing all of their funding that they put into the system. So it is various things that we consider there. We're looking at leverage, i.e. the match funding ratio. We're looking at the type of risk that the financial institution themselves are taking on versus what they're asking the Jobs Fund to take on. The other thing I want to talk about there is risk apportionment. We also want to talk about competition, right? The Jobs Fund grant cannot ever be used to distort a market. So, for example, if a particular entity comes and asks for a grant to do something, there are other entities doing this thing that they're doing. By providing them with a grant, we would effectively be increasing the return on investment at the expense of other entities. So we would look at that issue very, very carefully in this. One thing I will say and apologies, I omitted it previously, is that the minimum match funding requirements is what we need you to commit to in cash, right? Not in kind. So if you are, for example, contributing a piece of land to that, if you're not selling it to anybody, there is no cash. That is regarded as an in-kind contribution. In-kind contribution does improve competitiveness because it does help, it does assist in it, but it will not be used within the eligibility or assessment criteria in a judging where the match funding and who's more competitive for that, or who meets the minimum requirements. So please bear that in mind. It has to be a cash commitment. Next slide, please. Innovation. Innovation is contextual, right? I have to say that. It is innovative based on the type of industry we're talking about. It is innovative based in the geographic location we're talking about. So that's what we talk about, a notional type of innovation, right? What we will be looking for from applications is to show us what that innovation is, right? There's no point in giving us innovation if there's 20 other people doing the same thing, or something that you've done for the last 20 years, right? So it has to be innovative in the sense, like I said, it is contextual. We do understand that, and we do take that into account in assessing the innovation. I'm going to skip scale. I've spoken to scale about it. I think the issues are very clear there on the slide and in the term sheet, and people can refer to that when they get there. Next slide, please. Okay, contributed to systemic change, critical, right, for what we do. Because what we are looking for are projects that changes the paradigm in terms of how we create jobs and what process we go through, how we support an SME. If the application bears no resemblance or does not ever contribute to doing that, it is not as strong as one that does, right? Systemic change, if we're simply going to revert back to what we were doing prior to the project, after the project, then the project doesn't really contribute much to providing the innovation, providing the new method of doing things. So it's critical that, again, you show us the systemic change, because, again, it is contextual, right? Systemic change happens within a particular sector or with a particular geography. So it's critical that you highlight to us why you think there is systemic change for us to then review and assess that. Now, the last one of the impact criteria is capacity to implement. And also, I would add to that, readiness to implement, right? And here we're looking at, Xavier would have said earlier that we look to work with intermediaries, right? It is about the experience of that intermediary. It is about the capacity of that intermediary. The pipeline of projects from an on-lending perspective, have they got a good way of generating pipeline? Is there a pipeline in place? Right, so that when we actually start the project, we're ready to go and don't have to spend 6 to 9 months actually setting up things. That would, if that were the case, it would weaken your application. Readiness to implement also includes where there are certain regulatory approvals outstanding. For example, when you want to do something, you need an environmental impact study. We would need applications to explain to us where that process is and how long it's going to take, because it does impact whether we'll be able to implement a particular intervention within the required 3-year period. And then the ability and the systems must be in place within that intermediary, both so that they can implement the project, but also that they're able to report to us. Of course, we have reporting requirements. We have principles that we report to. So we require information, we require evidence that can then be auditable. And it's critical that the systems and the people are in place to be able to do that for us. I think that is me for those slides. I think it is. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, I hand you over to Zamile. We'll be looking at the indicators for this particular funding round. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazim. Good morning to the prospective Jobs Fund partners. My name is Zamile Ngubo. I'm a Jobs Fund representative. So I will be taking you through the indicators. So for us as the Jobs Fund to ensure that the initiatives that we are funding are moving in the right direction, it is of paramount importance that we put progress markers in place. So these progress markers are the indicators that the interventions will be contracted to. So we have a total of 8 program indicators, and not all of them will be applicable to the applicants. So they will differ from an initiative to an initiative. So it is the responsibility of the applicants to nominate the indicators that they think are best fit for their intervention. So I will start with the permanent job, which is the program indicator number 1. So this is a job that has never been there before. It came as a result of the funding from the Jobs Fund. Then we have fixed term jobs. So these are jobs that are being offered to work seekers for at least a minimum period of 12 months. Then we have short-term jobs. So these are less than 12 months. We have seasonal jobs, and these are prevalent with the agricultural sector. So for an example, during the planting season, you will have some people to assist in planting, management of crops, and also harvesting. So these are prevalent with the agriculture. Then we have informal sector jobs, because our focus in this funding round is also in the informal sector. So I will emphasize on that indicator. Next slide, Sane. So I have explained indicator number 1, a number of new permanent jobs. I've explained that this has never been there before. It came as a result of the grant funding from the Jobs Fund. So we've got seasonal jobs. We've got new fixed term jobs. I've explained that. Next slide, Sane. So indicator number 2, so number of beneficiary placed in current vacant permanent full-time positions with partners. So I will give an example. The initiatives that we have funded before and currently funding, they are in the support for work seekers, meaning that they will take a cohort of young people, train them so that they become more employable. So what normally happens is the partners that we are partnering with, they will also partner with the host employers or the people who will be taking the trained candidates. So this indicator is common within the support for work seekers. Also, within that indicator, there are sub-indicators, which is indicator number 2.1 and 2.2. So these are positions that are being created by project partners and also other partners as a result of our initiative. So placement beyond partners, participants are employed by companies or enterprises other than the project partners. For an example, in some instances, trained participants go on self-place because of the training that they have attended and acquired skills and knowledge. They can go out and look for work on their own without being placed by the partner of the Jobs Fund. Next slide, Sunny. So number of beneficiaries placed in current vacant permanent posts. These are participants, beneficiaries that may have successfully completed work seeker training. I've explained that. So current vacant positions exist, but it's currently not filled. For an example, a large corporate has 250 vacancies for client liaison officers, for an example, and they are battling to find suitably qualified employees. A work seekers project trains young unemployed graduates in the work readiness, sales, communication, etc., etc. So as a result of the training, these candidates can become more employable and be attractive in the labor market. So all these indicators are explained in the term sheet. So we are encouraging the applicants to read and understand the definitions of these. They are available in the term sheet that has been published. Next slide, Sunny. So we have got number of new short-term jobs. So these are jobs that are being created and are less than 12 months in duration. So for an example, if you are constructing a bridge, so that is a project. So, and the duration of the project is 3 months. So you will employ short-term construction workers. Then we have got number of beneficiaries completing time-bound internships. So we all know that graduates are experiencing challenges with respect to experience and skills. So initiatives normally offer internships to young people. So we do accept this and we only count them upon completion. Then we also have number of trained beneficiaries and as an indicator. So we do train people and you report these to the Jobs Fund and we only count them upon completion of the training. Next slide, Sunny. Indicator number 7, this is quite a new indicator, and indicator number 8, number of self-employed informal sector entrepreneurs. So here we are looking to support informal sector, the street vendors, spaza shop owners, etc., etc. So in this indicator, because these individuals cannot sign an employment contract with themselves, so what we normally do is we will engage them to say they must report after a period of 6 months. We can only count them as a job after a period of at least 6 months. Why we are doing that is to make sure that we track them over time to see how much are they making. And our measurement for that is the national minimum wage and the upper bound poverty line. So over time, we will check, then after 6 months, we average that. If they are at least at a minimum wage or above that, we start counting them as a job. Then indicator number 8, number of employed in formal sector workers. It's a job that is created in the informal sector, and the payment received for the job is equal to or greater than the national minimum wage. So these are explained in the term sheet. Next slide, Sane. So when you contract with the Jobs Fund, it is important that you report. So successful applicants will be required to report on their progress against their contracted program indicators that we have just explained now. In addition, successful applicants will also be required to track and report on the project-specific indicators. So you will see on the term sheet that you will be required to nominate over and above the program indicators that we have predetermined. So you will have to nominate your project-specific indicators. So now these are smaller milestones, smaller manageable tasks that are contributing to the attainment of the main program indicators. So during the appraisal stage, the team will be assisting in that, the applicants will be assisted in that regard. So the submission of the agreed upon means of verification. So when we contract with the projects, we agree on what can be produced as an evidence of the reported number of jobs, number of trained beneficiaries, etc., etc. Then another important point is the disbursements are contingent upon projects achieving at least a minimum of 80% performance against their quarterly target. So you are being measured against these indicators, and you must at least, at a minimum, attain 80% against your quarterly target. That can trigger the disbursements. Number 2 is the submission of evidence to support performance reports that we have submitted. So it is of fundamental importance that successful applicants have the systems in place and the capacity to adequately track progress activities, outcomes, and outputs, and report to the Jobs Fund as per the reporting requirements that will be shared with you. So, and please note that the delays in report submission results in delays in disbursements, which can fundamentally affect the project rollout and implementation and the carrying out of the activities. I think I will end there, and also just to say we have a multidisciplinary team that will be assisting with the applications. So I will hand over to Helena to take us through the contracting process. Thank you very much.
Helena, sorry, you're on mute, Helena.
You're on mute, Helena, if you're speaking.
Apologies, everyone. Apologies for that. I don't know what happened. Thank you for your patience and thank you for your time. We know it's been a lot of information, but it is shared on the Jobs Fund's website, and you'll see in the chat the link has also been posted. So when we get to the contracting, you will see that the grant agreement template, it is accessible on GMS. Applicants can view it to ascertain the terms and conditions contained in the grant agreement. Just remember that the grant agreement is subject to change. What Xavier spoke about at the beginning of this session is the due diligence documentation, the verification, and also the physical site visit. This is very important that you submit all the required information and that you also respond to all the questions. And take note that we may ask supplementary evidence and documentation so that we can complete our process. So should your application be approved by the investment committee, we will proceed with contracting. The draft grant agreement, annexures, and draft ABC PIMP will be shared with the successful applicants for commenting and inputs. The evidence required to meet the CPs for signing will also be communicated to the applicants. Once again, we remind you that the timelines are very tight and the applicant's cooperation and responsiveness in this regard would be greatly appreciated. Now, once the grant agreement and the ABC PIMP have been approved, it will be submitted to the applicant for signing. Once again, the turnaround times are stringent, so we request your cooperation and responsiveness, and I wish you well with your application, and I now hand you over to Alden.
Right, good morning, everybody. Let's see those emojis coming through. I think our presenters have done a fantastic job thus far. And it's also good to see that people are not sleeping here and the AI is being kicked out of the chat. So we have humans in the room. So again, I think that the most important part for us here as well in the next segment is really to emphasize that we had opened the round on the 22nd of April. We will be closing the round on the 5th of June at 3 p.m. I think that there was a question in the chat here about an extension. There are no exceptions to that closing date. 5th of June 2025 at 3 p.m. is our closure date for the round. It is a competitive process and hence the reason why no exceptions can be made. In terms of the actual application itself, it's all being done online through our online grant management system. I will show you and direct you how to get to that point if you haven't done so already. It's important for us to note that all the sections of the application needs to be completed as well as the supporting documentation. Once we've got to the point of actually submitting your document and we get past the point of the 5th of June at 3 p.m., we will be doing a screening around the eligibility criteria and the assessment of the actual applications. And again, we're not using AI in that particular instance. It's a physical check and, we encourage people to put their best foot forward in terms of submitting their proposals and making sure that they comply with the requirements in the documentation that we request from you at that particular point in time. Eligible applications will then be assessed against the fund's impact criteria, which Nazim has thoroughly explained through his presentation, and that further information on the application process can be accessed via the link that you see at the below. But like I said, I'll just take you through a very quick couple of slides if we can move on to the next one. The most important section here for us is to go onto our website, www.jobsfund.org.za, and within the website, you will then be able to access not only the link for the application form, but our brochure, the application user guide, and our FAQs. And my observation from the comments that have been coming through into the chat is that a lot of it is actually answered in the FAQs. There are one or two additional questions that we will pop in there, but the majority of questions that are coming through in the chat are actually contained within the FAQs. But in terms of accessing the application form, our online GMS portal, once you've accessed the website, there is a link that will take you to our online application form. It's just below the FAQ documents. There's a click here button, and once you click on it, it will take you to a landing page. So if you can just move to the next slide, please. On the landing page on the far left-hand side, you will then be able to register yourself if you haven't accessed the GMS system previously. That will allow for you to then create a username and password. Once you've accessed the application form itself, you would then have the opportunity to create your application. There is a section that talks about creation of a new application. It's clearly marked once you've logged in on the homepage of our online system. And that will then allow for you to create almost a sort of pre-registration process that you would undertake, where you would put in what the project name is, what type of business are you, what sector do you fall under, and this will then allow for a reference number to be generated from the system. The reference number is very important in the sense that if you have an inquiry or query or an issue, that you are able to then send us a explanation using that reference number, so that it makes obviously the support service a bit quicker in terms of us retrieving your record from the system itself. Once we've gone through the process of pre-registration, you would then complete the eligibility criteria tab. Now, this tab, as it's been discussed in the earlier presentations, has a number of questions that you would answer. And if you are successful in terms of the eligibility validation that would take place after you answer those questions, you will then see, as per point number 4 at the bottom, the rest of the application form. If we move to the next slide, just a couple of key tips and techniques. And again, all of this here is disclosed in the user guide that, again, I encourage you all to go and download. It's at www.jobsfund.org.za, and you can also find it on the online portal itself. But there are essentially 8 sections that you need to complete. All of those sections need to be finalized or complete, and the documentation submitted as it's been requested. There are prompts that will come up during your process of navigating the online application, and this is essentially giving you sort of warning messages. There are certain requirements or restrictions on word count, as an example. There'll be a pop-up message that will come up, and that also brings me to the last bullet point there, is to make sure that your pop-up blocker is turned off, or to allow pop-ups to messages to be displayed from our grant management site, because that's the mechanism that we use to alert users when navigating the system. We also have a validation feature that is a feature that will allow for you to make sure that you have dotted your I's and crossed your T's. That will run through the entire application, and any mandatory requirement will be outlined if it has been omitted. Again, the emphasis here is that no exceptions will be made to the submission date, which again I'm stressing is the 5th of June at 3 p.m. That date and that time is not going to be moved. If we move to the next slide, I think it's just a couple of next training steps. So if you haven't done so already, next week we have a more in-depth training session that is taking place on the 13th of May. You are able to access the session in the chat now at the moment, or you can go via our website. This training session is to give us more information around the activity-based costing project implementation monitoring plan, for short the ABC PIMP, which is one of the mandatory sort of tools that you need to complete and upload as part of your application. The online grant management system and how to navigate the system will be part of the training. Additional steps or additional information around the grant agreement and standard clauses, and then also we'll finalize it with what are some of the post-training support offered by the Jobs Fund within that training session. So please, again, I encourage you all, register for the training next week. It's going to be a little bit more in depth, as well as you can access it via the chat in terms of that link or via our website. If we move to the next slide, it just tells us about our contact details. Again, if you have any inquiries, please email us at jobson@treasury.gov.za. If you do have that particular reference number that I spoke about when you registered your application, please use that in the subject line to allow for us to respond to you a bit faster. But our online application details will be on the website, as well as I know a lot of questions have been posed about the presentation being submitted, etc. The recording and the presentation will be made shortly after the session concludes. Thank you, everybody. Love to see more emojis. And now we are going to be handing over to the head of the fund for closure. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I was furiously trying to answer as many questions as I could. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. I hope that all your questions have been answered. If not, as I said when we started out, we will take the questions that were posed here. We will update the frequently asked questions, and we will post that onto our website again. If you continue to be interested, next week, I think on Thursday, the 15th, we have a masterclass training session on how to complete the project implementation and monitoring plan. That is quite a useful one. It seems, at the outset, it will seem as a complex document, but I can assure you, once you have attended the training and we share with you the logic and how that document then becomes your mantra if you are successful in your application, and how it helps you over the entire period of implementation, I can assure you it's well worth your while to attend the training session. I'm not sure if there are still any other burning questions, but please do post them, and we will then respond to you in writing. It's also, and we do it this way because it's really useful then for other people who might have a similar question as you have to also respond. Thank you very much, and good luck with your applications.